Well, yeah.
I guess it's left up to me to introduce myself. At least I won't forget anything or get anything wrong, I guess. I'll just wait for the last few people to come in. I feel like I should be singing karaoke or something. Start spreading the news.
Well, don't stop.
You like my Australian accent? Okay, you've probably seen me around today. My name's Adrian Lee. I come from London. I'm going to be the only person here who puts their hand up and says I know nothing about UFOs. Probably not a good admission at the beginning of a talk on UFOs. I'm an art historian. I studied history to a very high level in Britain, specialising in the Renaissance period. I've been lecturing, or I lectured in Britain for about 14 years, and in the end of that career, I actually became a British government advisor for the curriculum on history and art. So all those school children at the moment complaining about history in their schools back in London have got me partly to blame for that. You can only judge the present by what's left to you from the past. I just want to briefly explain why I'm here in the country. About 15 years ago, I got contacted while I was lecturing history by a paranormal team in Britain, and they said to me, we do a lot of investigations in houses, we do a lot of investigations in haunted buildings. We could really do with a historian, because you've got research skills and you can find out who used to live there, all the events that took place in that building, anything that was significant, because I had those skills. And I agreed, because I thought that sounded like good fun. And it slowly dawned on me over a period of time that, of course, as a historian, all we're doing is putting a framework together to guess what actually happened back then, because we weren't there. So what I'm doing is putting an educated collection of facts and figures together and presenting them in a way that I think is my opinion of how things happen, which is, of course, how history works. So, as a historian, I thought to myself, wouldn't it be fantastic if I went on a journey where I could actually interview someone who died 200 years ago? And I thought, if I investigated ghosts and the paranormal, that option would actually be open to me. And subsequently, I've done that. And I've been in situations where I've talked to dead people, I've spoken to spirits and ghosts, and I've had those conversations, and they've actually given me facts and figures that I've then retrospectively gone and researched, and they've been true. So I co-founded the International Paranormal Society with my wife Lisa Lee, sat there. Oh, a round of applause, that's more than I got. I see, we're picking race over gender. Know your audience. I won't be making any jokes about Americans in that case. So we have teams all over Europe. We have teams in Australia, the Philippines, in the Midwest, and obviously I'm based in Minnesota now, so I have paranormal investigation teams, and I hunt, and I'm a paranormal investigator. I look for ghosts and spirits, but obviously I have an art history background. When I was studying for my MA, it suddenly became obvious to me that there was a lot of Renaissance paintings that I considered to have UFOs in the background of. So I put my hand up at the beginning and said I didn't know anything about UFOs. I know quite a bit about Renaissance art history, so this is where we are and this is where my presentation is. Could someone get the lights for me, please? Because obviously I'm a visual learner, so you'll be pleased to know that everything I have for you this afternoon is obviously very visual. This is going to make any historian in the audience cringe, because unfortunately I'm going to go through the entire history of the Western European world in 1 minute. Classicism. What I want to do very briefly is just put the Renaissance period into context. So obviously I'm going to jump straight in and we're going to look at UFOs and we're going to look at paintings, and it's going to be an awe and wonder moment, and it's going to be fabulous. But I do need to point out to you what the Renaissance period is and why. Because one of the things I want to do today, having come from an art history background, specialising in Renaissance Italian art, I want to talk about the political and economic reasons why there's UFOs. I'm not here to say, are there UFOs? They are there. I need to explain why I think they're there and the political and social situation that was surrounding the Renaissance period and why they were put there. Classicism. The Greeks, and copied by the Romans, put in place a lot of what I would call semiotics, a lot of the reasons why Western Europeans look at things and say they're beautiful is because conventions have been put in place over thousands of years of what it is for something to look attractive and for something to look beautiful. And the Greeks and the Romans embraced the idea of symmetry, harmony. They built their buildings with the columns, everything was worked out so it looked perfect. There's a ratio called the golden section that I'm not going to involve you with now, but there's maths to back this up as well. This is the reason why you may have seen television programs where you see pictures of models' faces like Kate Moss, and they put a graph over them and they say this is the perfect face because it matches all these ratios. Well, this is the period of history where these ratios were starting to be designed and put together. And of course, what I'm reflecting there in the Rolls Royce, just doing my bit for British economy, is to show you that those designs are still used in contemporary designs. Obviously, the Rolls Royce radiator grille is a reflection of the pediment and the columns on the Greek buildings there. So this is classicism. Obviously, the Greeks came up with the idea of the Olympics and the perfect human form and the perfect body. I think those gentlemen, if my memory serves me right, are Socrates, Plato, and Virgil, but we've got Lucretius as well. So this is a period of history where they're celebrating perfection, they're celebrating harmony. Do bear with me, because there is a point rumbling along in a minute. We then enter a period of history called the medieval period, and or the Middle Ages, and it was in the middle of classicism and in the middle of the Renaissance period. It's sat there in the middle, sandwiching the two. And this wasn't a particularly great time. Artistically and culturally, it was still a tremendous period for art and culture, but in terms of humanity, it was a pretty rough time. In 1366, 1 in 3 people died of the plague throughout the entire population of Europe. And of course, if you die of the plague, you then lose your workforce, you then lose the ability for people to plough and sow and to get crops and harvest. So you then have famine. Famine then brings disease. If the town down the road has got more food than you've got, then you go and invade them. So we're talking war, famine, disease, pestilence. Not a great time to be alive. The church then became very important because obviously if you had to get up in the morning and you had to motivate yourself to go into a field to plant crops and everything around you is pretty rough and miserable, the church would then say to you, well, you know, go about your day's work, and if you toil hard and you behave yourself, you'll go to heaven and you'll get everything you want when you die. So obviously churches became important. The art of this period was stained glass windows, illuminated manuscripts, architecture, tessellation in terms of mosaics. There was no such thing as an artist or the genre of being an artist, which is why the Renaissance came along and was so important. Obviously the disease and the pestilence and the wars and everything else was reflected in the architecture, and Gothic cathedrals littered themselves around Europe. The Renaissance, we got there in the end. Again, my apologies to any historians where I've just covered 1,000 years of history in 3 minutes. The Renaissance was underpinned by many things, like everything in life. You have a group of events coming together to make a whole. So there's not one reason why the Renaissance happened, but there's several things that took place that were a catalyst for the Renaissance period. First of all, there was invasions. The Ottoman Turkish Empire invaded Constantinople and invaded Greece, and all the scholars and all the universities in Constantinople fled with all their books and all their knowledge and ended up in Italy. So first of all, you've got this huge influx of knowledge coming into Italy that was unexpected. due to invasions of other countries. You've then got the sense that the Italians went out in their sailing ships and did exactly what the British Empire did 400 or 500 years later by having a fabulous navy, and went to other countries and stole all their silk and all of their textiles, brought them back, and obviously made vast sums of money from that. You've then got the invention of the printing press, so literature becomes important. Music is now able to be printed. I don't need to tell you about Dante's Inferno and other classical Renaissance books and so forth. And then, of course, finally, amazingly enough, art is the last thing that comes along. Normally art goes and society follows, but in the Renaissance, art was almost like a tag-on at the end. It kind of came along at the last knockings, which is really unusual. But architecture, music, literature came first, and then art followed, unusually. So we're now in a position where the Italians realise and are starting to go back to this idea of classicism, because they've got the Greeks coming into the country. They're starting to unearth their own artefacts from the Roman period, and they're starting to get beyond that miserable medieval period and starting to have an enlightenment about going back to things that are perfect. And as a good example of that, I've got Michelangelo's David. And when Michelangelo actually finished this sculpture, there wasn't much art for 50, 60 years afterwards. There was a bit of a void, because the whole of the Renaissance period was revolving around the perfect human form and how to create that. And when he created that, every other artist put their tools down and said, job done. Art's gone, art's dead, there's no reason to carry on. It wasn't until the likes of Caravaggio and the humanists that came 50, 60 years afterwards where they realised they could paint things that were ugly and grotesque faces that art then progressed again. I just want to outline this to you briefly. The reason this is here is because I want to outline how far the Renaissance spread. This will be relevant as we go into our UFO pictures, but this was the Ottoman Empire, and obviously around this coastline you've got the Yugoslavian countries, and then up here is Greece. And the ports of Florence, or should I say Venice, was an important trading for textiles and silk, so a lot of money was coming into there, but also the money was held in Florence, and they'd bring goods up the river into Florence as well. So these are two places where money is now congregating, and money obviously financed the opportunity to produce paintings and artwork. And I just want to outline, of course, that France is up here because that's going to be relevant, and the spread of the Renaissance from Italy is relevant in some of the slides I'm going to show you. UFOs, hurrah, there we go. That wasn't too painful, but it needs to be put into context, because what I'm going to explain a bit later on is why they're there. And that sort of context and that economic and political background is relevant to that particular part of the lecture. Some of my paintings that I'm going to show you, some of the illustrations, are stretching the boundaries of what I would call the Renaissance period. Some will be slightly earlier, some will be slightly later, but I'm not going to put some set dates in place that's going to avoid me showing you some really good slides of UFOs in artwork. The first one I want to show you, this is the crucifixion. It's in Kosovo. This is St. Stephen's Church, which is a very small, fabulous building, but it's not a huge cathedral or anything, it's just a small chapel. This fresco wasn't actually discovered, I think, until about 1968, when an Italian art historian went in there and suddenly realised there was very strange markings on the wall. A lot of people think art history is a very old discipline. It's been around for thousands of years. It's not. It's actually a very modern genre. Art history is a kind of a genre for teaching, a subject in its own right. It hasn't really been around too much before the 1940s and 1930s. In fact, it was inspired by the fact that Nazi Germany were wanting to write their own art history and were pushing German philosophers and German art historians out of the country, and they came to Britain and set up the Courtauld Institute. So I'd go as far as to say that art history as a genre, as a subject, has only been around for maybe 70 or 80 years in the form that we know it now. So we're in Kosovo, which is a small, it's in Serbia, but Kosovo wanted their own independence for many years, but it's actually in Serbia. And either side of the crucifixion scene, we've got these objects that I'll zoom in and show you in a second. One of the things I want to highlight for you before we go any further is how well rendered this is. We're just starting to get into the Renaissance period now, and the anatomy is still very basic, but it's very well painted. You've got the textures of the cloth and all the tonal contrasts and colours, and there's a bit of a stab at perspective, even though they're not quite sure what they're doing. It's the kind of perspective you'd expect a sort of 10-year-old to be doing now if they were asked to draw a castle wall with battlements. So we've got these two objects either side of Christ on this particular fresco. So let's go and have a look at these. Okay. A very interesting images, because what you've got here, the guy on the left, and the reason I've written the names of the artists up and where they are is because obviously you can go away and look at them yourselves and you'll get more detail than me blowing them up on a large screen. Obviously, because I've gone in to look at them in detail, some of the detail's been lost, but you will get the concept and the ideas. This guy here, who's on the left of Christ, is actually pulling on a lever. Even though levers were around then, they're pretty much an invention of the Industrial Revolution. And in this particular example here, this guy's pressing a button on a console. There's a whole panel in front of him with buttons on, and he's pushing a button. And I would suggest that the concept of buttons came about with electricity. You wouldn't need a button. It turns electricity on and off, doesn't it, and organises a flow of electricity. So I want to remind you, this is 1350, and you've got two rocket-shaped vehicles with one guy throwing a lever and this guy with a console on buttons. And again, you're welcome to go and look at these pictures on the internet. They're there for you to see, and you'll be able to see more detail if you look at those in your own time. What I started to do was wonder if people of that period actually had a knowledge that beings could come from other stars and other planets. So I found this quote. This is only 90, 80 years after this particular painting. But this particular cardinal says, "We are not authorised to exclude that on another star beings exist which are completely different from us." So even during this period of history, they're very much aware that beings from other planets and other stars can exist. Of course, the first thing I did was think that the insignia on the side of that rocket could be very familiar to us. So I've just matched those up with contemporary images of insignia. And if you were a peasant working in a field in 1350 and you saw that vehicle fly over, with your limited idea of visual perception of that period, that's probably quite a good depiction of what you'd expect an insignia or some sort of design or logo on the side of that rocket to look like. So again, I've put that up there to suggest perhaps there was markings on these vehicles, and the peasants working in the fields that saw this just replicated as best they could the things that they saw with their very underdeveloped psychology of perception. The other thing I've tried to do during this lecture is to compare these Renaissance paintings with contemporary photographs. So throughout the course of this presentation, what you'll find me doing is getting images off the internet of UFOs. Now, I have no idea whether they're faked, I have no idea whether they've been put together on Photoshop or anything else, but they're images that are put out there in the public arena that claim to be images of UFOs. But interestingly enough, whether they're real or not, the fact is they're in the human psyche as being in that design, and it's reflective of things we're seeing from 700-800 years ago. So you will find me starting to compare those images with images from contemporary photographs. I wouldn't be making any friends if I was in an art history university back in Britain, because many art historians, if not most, would actually at this point say they're other things, they're not UFOs, that can't possibly happen. You can't have rockets with guys pressing buttons and astronauts in a painting, a fresco in a church in Kosovo from 1350. And most art historians are very dry and very boring, and they would probably argue that those things don't exist. So they put together a series of arguments. You may be aware of the German philosopher Hegel. He came up with a concept that you would write a history paper, someone would write the opposite of that, which would be called an antithesis, and then someone will come along a lot later, put the two together and make a synergy of both of them, a synthesis. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through all the arguments that art historians would put together to say they're not UFOs, and I will remove their argument for them. That'll cheer them up. So let's deal with the first one. You may see my lack of coordination. That's why I'm limping at the moment, because I came off my motorbike last weekend. I'm probably the last person you'd ever want to put in charge of a vehicle. So, the first argument was they represent saints. So the first thing you do, of course, is find an image of saints painted from exactly the same period, and you see what saints look like. That's what saints look like. They've got halos around them. They'd have beaten gold coins and made some very fine copper plate to put on the, or bronze and gold to put around the halos. The idea of awe and wonder when you go into a church in the 13th, 14th century and you've got candles burning and it's dark and it's very warm outside in these countries and it's calm and it's cool and the gold's flickering in the light there is exactly what religion wants. It wants that awe and wonder moment. So you've got saints with halos. They're humans that have been martyred. And they tend to have symbols with them as well. The lady on the right is Saint Agnes. She's the patron saint of shepherds. She died a very miserable death that you perhaps need to read about rather than me explain it to you, because it will probably ruin your afternoon. So this is what saints look like. So we can dismiss this. Saints are represented in this period as humans, but with a halo, and they carry the symbolism of their martyrdom. Art historians say they're angels. They're meant to represent angels. So this is 1305. This is 45 years before that fresco is painted, and this is what angels look like. They're exactly how we would imagine angels to be. The semiotics of an angel is in place already during this period of history. They've got wings on and they fly around and they look angelic. Again, we've got sainted humans around that image. Just to embrace that even further, these are again images of angels from the same period of history. In actual fact, very interestingly, that's the Annunciation of Mary, where Gabriel tells Mary she's having a baby. And it crossed my mind throughout the whole of the last lecture when it was being discussed that a woman who hadn't had sex was conceiving a baby and then it was removed. And I suddenly thought, I've got an image of that where an angel comes down to tell Mary she's having a baby. And it's, as one student said to me once, a little 12-year-old looked up at me and said, "Was that an immaculate contraption?" And I said, yes, something like that. I put these in as well. This is something I've added recently because I'm working on a book on angels at the moment. This particular mosaic is in the Basilica of St. Mary, and that's 432. So we're 1,000 years, roughly, before that rocket image I just showed you, and angels still have wings, and angels still wear flowing gowns, and that semiotics has been put in place 1,000 years. So when art historians say they're angels, we were painting angels with wings 1,000 years before that. This is a medieval depiction of angels as well from about the 11th century. Interestingly enough, if anyone is a theologian, there's nowhere in the Bible it says angels have wings. There's only one place where the seraphim have wings. They have 6 wings and it covers them up. But that's only one place, and it's actually in reference to a different type of angel. There's not a single place in the Bible where it says angels have wings. It's only through art and semiotics that we've got that in place and we think angels have wings. I spoke about the fact that art historians would say that it's just symbolism, but in actual fact the Renaissance artists were very literal in their depictions. Here we have an example of Saint Stephen, and he was stoned to death, so the artist has put stones on his head. You know, it's very simple, they just depict exactly what they see. There's no messing around with difficult imagery. These are for peasants to come in out of the field uneducated who can't read and write, and these images have got to be seen and understood, so they're not going to mess around with complicated imagery. St. Stephen was stoned to death, so we'll put stones on his head. This poor unfortunate is called St. Lawrence rather. And St. Lawrence was unfortunately barbecued to death. So if you ever see a guy carrying around a barbecue with him or a gridiron, that's St. Lawrence. He was cooked. Nothing happens by accident. They will not paint what they do not want to be represented. This is the key. These images did not sneak into these paintings, they were put there on purpose. This particular guy was a cardinal, and he lost the right-hand side of his face in a jousting duel. The other side of his face didn't exist. So of course the artist chooses what they want to paint. Nothing happens by accident, and of course he paints him from his good side so you can't see that the other side of his face is missing. They're meant to be stars. This isn't the best image to see, but obviously this is the birth of Christ, and there's the Star of Bethlehem, and it's a yellow dot. I mean, This is how you would depict stars. I started to think about other types of artwork around at this period that I could compare that to as well, because I wasn't happy with that image, so I went and found that. Of course, tarot cards have been around thousands of years, and of course one of the major arcana cards of the tarot deck is the star, and this is from 15th century Italy, so it fits our timeline perfectly well. And of course we've got the image of the star. So the symbolism of stars is well established at this point as well. So if an art historian says it's depicting stars, well, I can show examples of stars. It's not a star either. So we're starting to slowly debase their arguments. They represent the sun and the moon. The reason I asked you to look at the first fresco, and I spoke about how fabulous the anatomy was and all the subtle curves in the clothing and the clothes they're wearing and the tonal awareness, is the fact that yes, this is the moon, this is the sun, but this is Byzantine art. This is thousands of years before that period, and you can tell that it's very naive, and you can tell by the way they depicted Christ that this is a whole different period of history. We're way beyond that. These are pagan ideas, and obviously in the Renaissance period, it was all about depicting Bible scenes on walls. There's not going to be any pagan gods involved. And again, if you represent the moon and you represent the sun, you've got a disc with a face in it, exactly now like you'd say you saw the face in the moon. They're not men sat in rockets with insignia on the side, pressing buttons and throwing levers. I will read this very quickly because it's pertinent. The sun and the moon, one on each side of the cross, are a regular feature of medieval crucifixions. They did not survive into the early Renaissance. Their origins are very ancient. It was the custom to represent the sun and the moon in images of the pagan sun gods of Persia and Greece, a practice that was carried over into Roman times on coins depicting the emperors. So all the things an art historian would put forward is to try and say that these UFOs or other things have gone. They do not exist anymore. So the question remains, why are they there? I'll put some bullet points together here, and I'll go through these, and I'll start showing you the UFO pictures, and we'll whiz through those quickly, and we'll have a look and have some fun with those. Number one, they literally painted what they saw without understanding what they were seeing. You see a rocket go over with flames and an insignia and a guy inside, you paint it. There's no thought process involved, you paint what you see. Number two, the sole reasons for the paintings was to depict the Bible text. So when dealing with scenes involving the godly and the heavens, they just drew upon the imagery they already knew. So if you're dealing with scenes of the heavens opening, and if you look throughout the Bible, and I'll come to this in a second, it's littered, if you take quotes out of context, with flaming platforms and strange frogs coming out of the mouths of dragons and all kinds of weird things. So they just painted what they knew, and if they saw objects going through the sky, they just associated those with God. Thus, we should be able to find the text that they attached to the UFO sighting. What they must have done was seen the UFOs, painted them on the walls, and then looked for the text in the Bible that represented what they saw. Nothing happened by accident. Everything was documented and accounted for. So they wanted those images in their paintings. The Catholic Church wanted to suppress fear in the population, so had to create answers for the masses. Does that sound familiar? This was 700-800 years ago, and it's still relevant to contemporary society. Let's go through those briefly. They literally painted what they saw. I've got some fabulous photographs of clouds. If you was to see those clouds, and you're in a field in Italy in the 14th century, you just paint what you see. You don't understand them. You think they happened, God has created them, but you don't understand them, and everyone's panicking, and they're saying, what are these strange clouds in the sky? So they include them in their paintings. They assimilate them into their culture. So there we go, the same period of history, we've got Masolino, and there's God, and the miracle of the snow, and you have the same clouds we've just seen in the previous photograph. You paint what you see. They're not UFOs, they're clouds, fairly obviously. They're very simple with their depictions. Their psychology of perception is underdeveloped. Just very briefly, I want to touch upon the fact that we see the world in 3D. We have toys to play with when we grow up. We're aware of television, we see films. We're aware of the concept of 3 dimensions and things being solid. If you can imagine you're a peasant working in a field in 14th century Italy or Kosovo, you've got a very underdeveloped psychology of perception. You do not see the world in the same way that I see the world and you see the world. So when this painting was done by Masaccio, this is one of the first examples of linear perspective. He actually devised a system where using a grid and horizontal lines, you can create the sense of depth on a 2D surface. When this fresco was unveiled in 1427, the people that went into the church, it's in the Santa Maria Novella in Florence, actually went round the back of the church to see if they'd built an extension. They were touching the wall because they couldn't understand the depth involved. And you laugh at that lack of knowledge and lack of psychology of perception, what happens between the eyes and the brain. But I bet every single person in this room, when they first saw a hologram, touched the hologram to see that it wasn't coming out of you and that it was flat. So I can associate things that have happened in my life that gives me an understanding of how a 14th century Italian was thinking. That's the Santa Maria Novella in Florence, and this fresco is actually painted on this wall on the inside. So they came out of the door, walked round the side to see if an extension had been built. The sole reason for these paintings was to depict Bible's text. The idea is education. People go to a church, they don't have the printed book, people can't read and write, they paint scenes from the Bible around the walls, and this creates the genre of art. The reason the Renaissance is important is it creates art as a specific subject. Because before Michelangelo and before Leonardo da Vinci, artists were just considered to be in the chemists' guild because they had to mix their own paints up. And subsequently they were artisans. There was no such subject as art. So the reason the Renaissance is important is because it creates art as a specific subject. So what I need to do, of course, is to find the Bible phrases that go with the images of the UFOs and the scenes. And of course, I spoke earlier about clouds, so we have Revelations. And they heard a great voice from heaven saying unto them, come up hither, and they ascend up to the heavens in a cloud, and their enemies beheld them. You can understand why people look at clouds like that and think it's a UFO, can't you? And that one, fabulous. I won't read all those out, but there's several quotes in the Bible that are relevant to clouds. So to go back to my point, they paint what they see. They see bizarre clouds, they put bizarre clouds in a painting and then put biblical text to it to justify that sense of why is there strange clouds in the sky? The masses come to the church because the church educates. They're saying, we don't understand, we're seeing all these strange things in the sky. They assimilate them into their paintings, and then it suppresses the fear and suppresses the masses. This is the most important part of this lecture, I suspect. So I'll just outline this and then we'll look at a whole series of UFO pictures. Nothing happens by accident. This is a very expensive business. The only reason this can be done is because the church holds all the money and is very wealthy. This here is lapis lazuli. When this mineral is ground up, it makes blue, and it's the only pigment that makes blue. It is mined by hand in Afghanistan, shipped over to Italy in the 14th century, and is 8 times more expensive than gold. So the most important person in Italian Catholicism is Mary, the Madonna. If you go to Italy, Madonnas are everywhere. So the most important person gets to wear blue. So we associate Mary wearing blue, and in the school nativity when you were younger, there was always the clever girl in the class that sat there with a tea towel on her head wearing a blue blanket, and that's solely down to economics in the 15th century. I suspect she probably never wore blue, if she existed, but we associate these things. Everything is contracted. They contracted how much blue was going to be involved in that painting, down to the last milligram. They know how much gold is going to be used. Everything's sorted out beforehand. They would produce what's called a cartoon. They'd have a huge sheet of paper. They'd do a very rough sketch of what they want on the church wall because it's fresh plaster with the painting then painted onto it very quickly. So they would do a cartoon first, the Pope would look at it, or the church would look at it and say, yes, that's great. They would then get a small pin, they would go around the outline of that cartoon, push it against the wall, rub charcoal over it, peel it off, and they've got a dot-to-dot pattern of basically their images of what they need to paint very quickly. So what you get, of course, is images that are very similar to one another, because lo and behold, all they do, of course, is peel off the cartoon with the holes in it, turn it around and put it on the other side and rub it again so you get the duplicate image whilst the plaster's drying very quickly. So nothing gets in by accident. Everything's accounted for. It's all, we know more about Masaccio from his tax returns and his contracts than we do about him from any other source, which is quite remarkable and just outlines how much the Italians like paperwork and bureaucracy. There's no possibility of artistic license. There's no backgrounds. They're unimportant. This is the story of Jesus. Why do we need to have trees? Why do we need to have a landscape? It just detracts from the lesson we're trying to give, and it also costs money. To paint these trees cost them a vast sum of money. Why would you include things that are irrelevant? Everything's contracted, everything's drawn up, nothing gets past the approval of the cardinals and the popes, everything is nailed down, nothing is happening by accident. They must have been very frustrated, they must have been dying to paint landscapes and bowls of fruit. I said I was going to show some leeway in what I consider to be the Renaissance period. I will be showing you images that fall outside of that, but they're so good, why would I not show them? The Catholic Church wanted to suppress fear in the population, so they had to create answers for the masses. If we paint the UFOs we're seeing in the paintings and associate God with them and text from the Bible, everybody's happy. So we've got the baptism of Christ from 1710. I said I was stretching the Renaissance period. And again, you've got the archetypal UFO with the beams of light. And interestingly enough, the text that they would have used with this image can be looked at in a context of aliens and UFOs. I don't claim to be an expert on the Bible, by the way, but if you study the Italian Renaissance, you learn by default almost. And Jesus, when he was baptized, went up straight away out of the water, and lo, the heavens were opened unto him, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and lighting upon him. Then was Jesus led up of the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted of the devil. So there's the text that goes with the painting. Everybody's happy. As I said to you previously, I'll try and find contemporary photographs to match the UFOs, because I get a sense that we've been looked at and we've been analysed over a period of thousands and thousands of years. So if I can find contemporary images that represent or manage to look similar to what they're trying to paint in the Renaissance period, then it obviously reinforces that argument. That's the best one I found. Bearing in mind UFOs emit light and all paint does is reflect it, we're on the same page if you can take that into consideration. Having looked at the biblical text, I then found an illustration that was in a book. There was a flaming girder or a platform in the sky. This was spotted in 1465 and was documented. And of course, as I'm starting to look at the Bible, I then see pages and pages and pages of text that refer to flaming platforms. I'm not going to read all these out. You're welcome to go and look them up. That is an actual photograph taken from an aeroplane looking down towards Greenland, and below the plane there's this platform shape hovering in the air. And again, there's a whole list there of biblical quotes that, taken out of context, could obviously be reflective of UFO activity. A whole series of things on platforms and flaming clouds and things descending and hovering and going up and down and scaring people in fields. In fact, I found 14 of them. I think I'm right in saying that I found over 108 quotes in the Bible that, out of context or in the same context, could be considered to be encounters with UFOs and aliens. As I said, I'm not going to read all of those out, but if you wish to come and see me afterwards, I'll certainly list them for you. The vehicle protected the people. They were afraid of the vehicle hovered. There's all kinds of things there. And again, I found another illustration from the 15th century that again had this flaming pillar, but on this occasion as well, they also had a flaming wheel. This wheel appeared in the sky, and you can imagine a UFO to a 15th century Italian with this wheel spinning round, and they've got nothing to base that on. They've got no knowledge of what these things could be, so their best description for that was a flaming wheel that was spinning around. And again, this happened in France. I mentioned France when I was showing you the map of the Renaissance period. In 1680, a French medal was actually made commemorating a UFO object in France. And then, as I said I was going to do, I then put the biblical text next to the image. And when the living creatures went, the wheels went by them. And when the living creatures were lifted up from the earth, the wheels were lifted up. So that's an actual quote directly from the Bible about wheels in the sky and people being lifted up and vehicles hovering. Our first speaker, Dean, touched upon some of these slides, but I will show you them in a bit more detail. This is very interesting. Again, remember, nothing's there by accident. Everything's contracted. They would have done preliminary sketches, preliminary drawings. The paint's 8 times more expensive than gold. They're solely depicting Bible scenes. There's no artistic license. And then we have a flying saucer over Mary's shoulder, which is isn't a star. There's no way that's a star because I've already shown you stars. We know it's not saints because saints are humans with halos. We know it's not the sun and the moon. Well, there's only one of them for a start, but sun and moon depictions were finished 1,000 years before, because the last thing the Catholic Church wants to do is depict scenes of pagan gods. We know they're not angels because we were painting angels with wings and flowing gowns from 370 onwards. So all those arguments are now gone, and we know it's there for a reason. And this guy can't see it. He's looking over here somewhere. And the dog's got a perfect vision of that, and it's sat there with its mouth open, and I just thought that was a nice little quote to bring in at that point. How's that a star or an angel? How can they say that? It's outrageous. There's 2 people saying that. Remember, again, they're dealing with paint that reflects colour and doesn't admit it, but that's the best they can do. And again, I've got my quote there, that if you offered that up to the image, we'd probably do that justice, I suspect. And now, of course, I'm looking for UFO images that look like the paintings I'm seeing from the Renaissance period. So again, 2 contemporary photographs of vehicles that you would argue are fairly similar in size and shape to the image we've just seen in the 15th century Renaissance painting. We're going to rush through these now because I just want to show you one after the other. This isn't just isolated single images. We've got a whole body of work here with UFOs in. Again, the Annunciation, interesting that the Annunciation comes up again after we spoke about the idea of having, Mary and the idea of Gabriel coming to her, and that idea we spoke about in previous lectures today about babies being taken and fetuses being experimented on. And again, I'll close in on that. That's the best I can do with that image, but again, you're welcome to look these up. I'm trying to now look again for contemporary images, and I put my hand up at the beginning and said I'm no expert on UFOs, and I'm happy to be corrected, but I believe there's something as a kind of bio-UFO that's like a jellyfish. So this was taken in Japan in 2004, and you could imagine that this image, using their limited perception and limited paints and limited ideas, could actually reflect that kind of bio-UFO that I believe exists, where they think they're made up of living parts, if you like, rather than metal. And again, I've got the quote there from the Bible that would back up that particular scene, because all Renaissance art is reflecting Bible text. Paolo Uccello, we're still in 1465. This was quite interesting. I've got a UFO coming out of the cave with what looks like a vapour trail. Again, it talks about lenticular clouds here, and again, you can look that up. All these images are available if you type these artists in online. I'm not going to say I found these are all out there. It's just putting them together and understanding why they're there. I actually turned this black and white to make it easier to see, and again, you've got similar objects here with vapour trails. I mean, obviously, you're not going to have anything to do with vapour trails in the 14th and 15th century. We're moving outside of the Renaissance period now. I just want to show you some of these illuminated manuscripts. This is a 12th century manuscript, Latin. It depicts the Saxon siege of Sigeberg Castle in France in the year 776. The Crusaders had the medieval French completely surrounded when the flaming shields suddenly appeared in the sky. The manuscripts report this as being over a church. Assuming the French were being protected, the Saxons fled in fear from the UFOs. And the thing that upsets me the most about this is the French didn't get a good hiding. We've been at war with the French for thousands of years, they love us. And again, I've put in my Bible text there to do with evil in the skies, and I found a contemporary photograph that looks remarkably similar to what an 8th century artist can do in a manuscript with limited skills and limited equipment. That was the second scene in the book, and again I've included the text from Exodus. This is a broadsheet picture and illustrates flaming large black globes that were reported in the skies over Basel in 1566. And again, if you can see these big black shields here, we're not a million miles away, are we, when we're looking at contemporary images of UFOs. And again, this was happening 500 years ago. That's quite a nice one. Some of you may be aware of the work of the French writer Voltaire. This was an illustration in his book. And again, I found a contemporary image that's remarkably similar to the illustration that's in the book. And again, I can keep going through these images. This isn't just one or two paintings. There's a whole body of work here. Illustrations in books, pen and ink studies, frescoes, work painted on altars and the like. The other thing I did, when I was looking at the Bible, it's amazing how many pieces of text actually sound like UFO activity. Again, I apologise if I'm offending anybody with religious background here, but all I'm doing is taking these quotes and placing them in a slightly different context. There was a war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back, but he was not strong enough and they lost their place in heaven. There's a whole series of texts here. Again, contemporary photographs and just parts of the Bible that I then found interesting, looking at Renaissance paintings and trying to apply text from the Bible to those. I love this one. Obviously this is a Hollywood photograph, but the text from the Bible fits that perfectly well, doesn't it? Then I saw 3 evil spirits that look like frogs. They came out of the mouth of the dragon, out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet. They are spirits of demons performing miraculous signs, and they go out to the kings of the whole world to gather them for the battle on the great day of God Almighty. I mean, if you're imagining frogs coming out of mouths and giant dragons with fire and so forth, it's not a great leap, is it, to imagine the grey aliens and the vehicles that they're coming in having all the flames and the fire around them. So I just found that a very interesting quote. And I don't want to dwell on this too long, of course, but there is a whole new lecture on angels and aliens and astronauts and so forth. So again, this applies to angels, but when you're looking at the spacesuit from the Mercury missions that you had back in the 50s and the early 60s, there's a remarkable similarity. They appear as normal human beings. They appear as bright, shiny beings that terrify those that see them. They appear in people's dreams. We had an interesting discussion earlier with the hypnotherapist, Craig, and he would probably be touching upon that in his work. They appear to animals, but invisible to humans. I highlighted that for you in the painting of the Madonna. They appear in the form of a plague, and they appear in flames of fire. And you're probably aware of these photographs. They're very famous, still from 1973, I believe. Not just quotes from the Bible, but religious people in general were actually believing that there were beings. I started with a quote, and it says, if the devil would take the initiative, not a single living being would remain on earth. That's from 1246. And again, there's a Jesuit priest here that wrote in the 19th century, it's absurd to claim that the worlds surrounding us are large, uninhabited worlds, that the meaning of the universe lies just in our small, inhabited planet. We like to believe, don't we, that we're the most intelligent being contemporary compared to our ancestors, but they actually had these thoughts. This is an image from a book, 1338. This sphere, to me, looks like the Montgolfier balloon, but obviously this is the 14th century. They're actually exchanging seeds, which seems a very bizarre thing to do. If an alien came down and wanted to take samples with it, it would take livestock and seeds, wouldn't it? And then you've got these really strange faces in the rocks. They're very kind of grotesque, and they're worked into the landscape. So there's some very strange things going on. You've got daylight stars, so there's a lot of bizarre semiotics in this painting, and I think that sits really nicely with that kind of engraving. They're remarkably similar, but obviously 500 years apart, give or take. And then there's my contemporary photographs, trying to find examples of what that could be now, that they perhaps saw then, that they try to depict with limited tools. This is probably one of the most famous ones. This is in Montalcino in Italy, San Lorenzo Church. You've got to remember, this is 1600, okay? There's Jesus, there's God. The dove represents the Holy Spirit, and of course in every 1600 painting there's a satellite. I will show you that in more detail, bear with me, I'll come back to this. There's the contemporary photograph of the UFO. That's Vanguard, which I believe was your response to Sputnik back in the late 50s. I turned those photographs upside down and then I blew up the satellite image. Can I just outline to you several things? Plate metal welding, obviously something that was common in 1600. Flashing diodes and lights. That's obviously some button or some kind of knob to turn or twist. Again, you know, I would suggest that buttons only came along due to the Industrial Revolution. There's articulated concertinaed aerials. These are like your car aerial that goes down on itself, if you can imagine that. And they've got their hands on those. I would ask you again, does that look like a star? Does that look like an angel? Does that look like a saint? Does that look like the moon and the sun? I have no idea what that is. It sends chills down my spine. I can't explain why there's a satellite in a 1600 painting other than it fell out of the sky or they managed to get hold of one somehow. If anyone has any explanation for that, I'd be welcome to hear it afterwards. Talk at the end. Very briefly now, obviously artwork isn't just about paintings on walls, there's embroideries and tapestries, and we're in Belgium now, and you've got the quintessential UFO image in the backgrounds of all those tapestries. Again, not just one example, there's a whole raft of these images. They're not just in isolation, that's the key. You could pick any period in any country and they're there if people want to look for them. And trust me, I've looked through a lot of French 15th century tapestries. Again, top right hand corner. This was in Belgium again, so we're in the Low Countries once again, and you've got the same kind of imagery there. I guess you could argue those are clouds, but it just happens so often and in so many pieces of artwork that that argument wears a bit thin after a while. I just want to finish off on this because this is what excites me. I said at the beginning I don't know much about UFOs. This is almost a visual representation of the history of mankind. You've got the cave painting from prehistoric times. So, you know, we're talking 15, 20,000 years ago. You've got the UFO, you know, carved into the wall with bits of charcoal and bits of chalk from the fire. And our ancestors are depicting the things they saw in the sky. And it's easy to believe that those dots would represent a very basic way of showing how many people came out of that, or how many moons ago it was, or how long ago that took place. But it's almost some sort of recording data, isn't it, that you would put dots there, especially when you haven't got numbers, you know, in your psyche at that stage. Then we have the tapestry from the 15th century. So we've moved on, and we've got exactly the same image, and then I find a contemporary photograph. Would this not suggest that we've been observed and viewed throughout the entire history of mankind? And as we like to document things, we've done that as cavemen, we've done that as Renaissance artists, and we're doing that with digital photography right now. So I just think that's quite a telling image for me, that we've perhaps been observed and we've perhaps been looked at throughout our entire history, as was suggested in earlier presentations. So I just want to end by saying that the images I found aren't in isolation. There's a whole body of work there. The art history argument for what they are doesn't exist. I've removed that Hegelian theory. And nothing happens by accident. They've got to have been put there by the church for a reason, because it costs a lot of money, and there's lots of preparations that go into painting a fresco or producing a tapestry. So those things can't happen by accident. I don't claim to have the answers to those. It was just a very interesting journey for me as someone who's studied Renaissance art and has an interest in the paranormal, to see those things put there. Several things I would like to do. If you're interested in my organisation, I've got some website details for you. We are doing lots of, as I said at the beginning, I'm a paranormal investigator. I'm normally dealing with the dead. In fact, as a historian, I'm only normally interested in people that are dead anyway. But I've got a book coming out in January on the history of the hauntings in Minnesota. So if people are interested in that, that's something that's coming out through Llewellyn Press in January. And if you're interested in taking those details down, we're doing some investigations over the next 2 or 3 weeks. Obviously, during the Halloween period, you can imagine how busy a paranormal investigator is with the press and everything else. But if you're interested in perhaps seeing what we do and coming out with my team and investigating haunted properties, we have got some dates coming up, and if you want to jot them down and put your name forward for those, my wife will take those details for me, the lady there with the white top on. And we're in Mantorville in Dodge County investigating for the whole weekend, and that's happening on the weekend of the 26th, 27th of November. We're doing a paranormal investigation of an 1870s shop in Sauk Centre, up past St Cloud, just before Alex. That's on the 22nd of November, if people are interested in that. Sorry, October, my apologies, the 22nd of October. And then we're up in Walker by Leech Lake, just south of Bemidji, on the 4th and the 5th with our team. And we're investigating up there. If people want to come along and join us, they're welcome to do so. If we turn the lights on, I'll take some questions if people have any. Yes, sir.
The Sputnik painting that you had on there, the one that I came across, I read that they explained that, but the Sputnik painting that you had on there, I had come across, and what I had read about that was that it was a depiction of the universe or the solar system. It's contained the models of the planets and the Earth and the Moon, and it was very commonly depicted, it said, and just brushed it off just like that.
I can see there'd be elements within that image that they could argue that away. The thing that intrigues me is that you have those plate metal strips overlapping one another. And then the aerials, I don't know how you could argue away. Certainly you could say that the yellow light that's glowing could be the sun. I don't know how you'd explain away an aerial that's articulated and concertinaed.
Absolutely.
And it's not just one piece of semiotics within that. There's a whole body of things that you'd have to explain away other things, wouldn't you, I guess? So that would be my argument back to that. And our historians want to dismiss this. They don't want to take that on board. Yes, sir.
Yes, one of the last slides that you showed had 3 different versions of the broad-brimmed hat type of UFO.
Yes.
And it might be of interest to everyone here to know that in the fall of 1979, such a craft was reported about 2 blocks east of here at the intersection of 694 and 35W. It supposedly stopped cars on 35W in both directions. And on about that date, or in that general time frame, it was also, a similar craft was also seen near the shopping center up 694 here at Silver Lake. So
I think the suggestion is that those objects are seen so regularly throughout countries all over the world at different time periods that just backs that up in many respects, that it happens here as well and contemporary in our times. It's just a nice illustration of 3 examples of humanity and us documenting things, because as humans we like to document. How many buffalo we've killed today, or how many woolly mammoths we managed to track down. And those things, if you think about the process of how long it takes to put a tapestry together, that can't happen by accident. It's not someone just doing a doodle on a bit of paper. Those tapestries are all laid out, and they're one thread at a time. It can't happen by accident. It's impossible for that to take place. Yes?
The hat-shaped depiction reminds me in The Little Prince, there's a picture of a snake that swallowed, a boa constrictor had swallowed something, and it's that same shape, and the Little Prince is from another planet.
I think you're right that you can compare those images. I could talk for days about images on cave walls and all the landing sites in Peru, and you can go back to the Egyptians. There's so much to discuss in terms of creativity and art that you have to almost narrow it down to get it into an hour. You could talk for a whole 10-week period about different civilizations around the world and different types of creativity, and then apply images of what you'd consider astronauts and UFOs to those. Yes, sorry, ma'am.
That's okay. I would like to know who the artist was on the painting that had the Sputnik-looking image in it?
Yeah, Salembino. If I see you at the end, I'll spell his entire name out because he's missed out a lot of vowels, unfortunately.
Do you have any opinion as an historian on the Kensington runestone?
I haven't even seen the Kensington runestones, and I personally believe that Vikings were here. I don't know if that's controversial or not. It's not a great leap of faith, is it? Because you leave Scandinavia, you can make it across to Britain, because we were raped and pillaged by Vikings all the time, especially after the void of the Romans leaving in 400 AD. So the Vikings got to Britain. We know the Vikings got to Iceland, which is the next island on. We know the Vikings got to Greenland. That's without any doubt. It's to move down from Greenland into Canada, there's only several small islands, and before you know it, bearing in mind that during that period, it's possible to move along the coast. I mean, why is that improbable? It's not like they've gone from Britain or Scandinavia straight over to America and travelled 4,000 miles by longboat, is it? They've done it in small stages using all the land masses. And I think I'm right in saying that when I went to see the Kensington runestones in Alexandria, they've got artefacts there of axe heads and other bits and pieces that were considered to be Viking. So when you've got other artefacts there that are Viking, when you've got a runestone that's Viking, when it can be proven that you can work your way around the islands, why is that so bizarre? My sister's an Egyptologist, and she studies in London, and she said one of the things that interests her was as they was unwrapping the bandages around a mummy, they found cannabis seeds. And cannabis comes from South America, and this is the Egyptian period. And how does that happen? So if you can get cannabis all the way through South America, through the Australasias and up into North Africa, I'm sure 3,000 years later you can get on a longboat and go through Britain, Iceland, Greenland and Canada. How's that improbable? It's already proven it can be done in other places. So to answer the question, I would be fairly convinced that Vikings were here. Why not? The evidence is there to support that. Yes, sir.
Sir, are you aware of the Heavener runestones in Heavener, Oklahoma? I had visited a Viking museum down there, and they have much writing there, and I just became aware of that ruin and that museum a couple, 3 years ago.
I wasn't aware of that. Obviously, my studies, I've only been here 3 years on and off, so a lot of my studies are very narrow in terms of writing about the history of the country, and Minnesota is what I focused on. I'm actually the vice president of the local historical society in Sauk Centre, and I find it very odd that people go to the museum in Sauk Centre and they ask them questions, and my cell phone rings and they say, Adrian, we've got guys down here asking about the history of Minnesota, can you come and talk to them? And I'm thinking, well, I've only been here 2 years, am I qualified to do that? So that amuses me. But that's cool. So, I haven't ventured too far beyond the Midwest just because I haven't been here that long, but it is on my agenda to go to other places and to look at what they've got as well.
So I have a question.
Yes.
Have you expanded your artistic search beyond European Renaissance?
I haven't. It's as I said to you earlier, this is, I don't often get to lecture anymore about art history, and to touch upon UFOs is very rare for me. I just put this together for MUFON because I thought it was a very interesting thing that people should be aware of, and I have theories as to why they're there, which is why I presented to you. I've not presented any new images that aren't already there, but what I can do as an art historian is actually tell you why they're there and how they came about. You're absolutely right. There's a whole lectures you can do on South American artifacts, Aboriginal artifacts, or their dreamscape paintings, and there's a whole book there to be done on that, I guess. But those things are out there if people want to see them. But I've not focused on that just because I don't have enough time, unfortunately.
Yeah, my question would be in the same vein. I've read books on Indian culture, Indian art, and they have a rich history of dating back thousands of years ago. And he talked about the Vimanas that were craft and atomic wars. And it's supposed to be pretty authentic, so it may be an area you could check into.
Yeah, I'm sure I could spend the rest of my life looking at artifacts and associating art history with those. And my knowledge of the Bible, again, perhaps isn't as extensive as I would like it to be. But there's definitely possibilities to do lectures in the future and to look into those things. And perhaps I'll be talking to you next year where I put together something on Native American art would be quite interesting. Seeing I'm here, that would be something I'd like to look at. So we may meet again next year and I'll present a whole new set of paintings and pictures for you if you're happy for me to do that. Fabulous. If anyone wants to chat to me about ghosts and hauntings, and as I said, if anyone's interested in going on a paranormal tour or an experience, especially around the Halloween period, if you talk to my wife Lisa Lee, she'll take your contact details, and those things are available if people want to experience what it's like to go on a paranormal investigation with a team and with all the equipment and so forth. So that's open to you. So thank you for your time, and I hope that you've learned something you can take away with there. I appreciate that. Thank you.